I was originally scheduled for Apollo 14, which would be the natural selection. I was the backup commander on Apollo 11, and then selected to go over to the Apollo 14 flight. Al Shepard, who was grounded for many years, I think, due to I think it's called Meniere's syndrome, which was a lack of balance due to a problem with water on the ear or something, had a successful operation that cleared the problem that he had. And so he, being a very aggressive individual, lobbied very hard for a flight on the Apollo program, and they gave him a flight of Apollo 13 right after Apollo 12. As he started to train, and of course we had been training for some time already, and I already had been training in Apollo 8 and Apollo 11, it dawned on NASA management that Shepard, having only one 15-minute suborbital flight, and now we're going to send him to the moon to land on the moon and the whole thing and do exploration, that perhaps they ought to give him a little bit more time to train. And so one day Deke Slayton came to me and asked me if I would mind giving him my Apollo 14 flight, and I would take his Apollo 13 flight. Well, I was happy about that. They would allow me to go to the moon about 6 months earlier. I had all the training. Merely our training now was just getting revised now with the lunar module and the experiments that we're going to do and how we're going to explore this place called Fra Mauro. So that's how it came to pass. I said, sure, I'll train.
When
there was no consideration that I know of. Now I can't read other people's minds of taking the whole crew off the flight and because Ken Manley was getting the measles. But as a matter of fact, of course, the backup crew entirely had not trained for about 2 months. So if they got the backup crew in there, and the person who got the measles was the backup lunar module pilot, Charlie Duke. So he had the measles. So, I mean, if they put the backup crew in, he was already out anyway. Consequently, the only idea was to replace Manley with his own backup, Jack Swiker, who did not have the measles. I argued, of course, with the doctors for some time because I didn't want to lose Ken. We were, a tightly knit crew at that time. But of course, my arguments fell on deaf ears. But fortunately, Swiker was a very competent pilot. I know that the movie showed him as sort of earning his wings every day because he hadn't trained, but he had actually written the malfunction procedures for the command module. Consequently, if you're going to have a replacement, that's the guy to have, and we were very fortunate to have him. No, I think actually if you're going to accomplish the missions that you have to accomplish and where you want to land on the moon with the proper sunlighting conditions, that you probably have to get off that free return trajectory. And once you establish that the spacecraft is in good operation condition and that the maneuvering engine is functioning fine, then I don't think that getting off the free return is a bad decision. It was bad for us because of the particular accident that Apollo 13 had, but actually I would have done it again. Let me kind of go over the scenario of the accident of Apollo 13 because in Chris Kraft's statement about the idiots who did it, he might have some validity for saying that, but this is a classic case of an aircraft type accident. And when I say a classic case of an accident is that it's usually not one basic malfunction that overcomes either the pilot or the airplane. It's a series of small things that build up that suddenly overcome the pilot or the airplane. And this was essentially the same thing. About 5 or 6, maybe 7 years before Apollo 13 was to take off, even Apollo 7 to take off, NASA told all of the manufacturers to make the spacecraft compatible, the electrical part of the spacecraft compatible with the higher voltage that was then at Cape Kennedy, about 65 volt DC power, even though the spacecraft was designed and flew for all its missions at 28 volt DC power. The purpose was that with the higher voltage at the Cape, tests could be done a lot quicker, things could be done faster, and they had the availability of the power there. Everybody did that in the design of their systems, with the exception of the person who designed the heater system in the oxygen tanks of the spacecraft in the service module. The little thermostat that was in the heater system that would prevent the heater system from overheating, and of course it does that by opening up the little contacts. That little thermostat was only compatible with 28 volt DC power. Now all the spacecraft up through and including Apollo 13 flew with that wrong type of thermostat because it was not compatible with the higher voltage at Cape Kennedy. But up until 13, no one ever had a use of keeping the power of the heater system on long enough for the little thermostat to even actuate, because the temperature never got up to that high, so no one ever realized it. A second incident occurred on the particular oxygen tank that was coming down the line that finally found itself in Apollo 13. Originally designated to go into Apollo 10. It was dropped at the factory. Not a big drop, just a small jolt. They picked it up, of course, completely tested it, refurbished it, completely tested for everything that tank would have to do on a flight to the moon. It passed everything. The one thing that they did not test was how to remove the oxygen on the launch pad after a test. In other words, they put the oxygen in and then they have to force it out. That particular little test was never done. The chalk mark that said Apollo 10 was erased, and because of the timing of the spacecraft, this was dropped back to Apollo 13. Tanks were put in the service module, everything was fine, everything was shipped to the Cape. Several weeks before the launch, on a routine test which we call a countdown demonstration test, everything is in place, everything is loaded up, oxygen is put into the tanks, hydrogen is put in the tanks, the major fuel tanks of this booster are not filled, but everything else is there. People are in place. We do a countdown demonstration test to make sure that everybody knows what they're doing, crews in the spacecraft, and that all the systems that we can see that are working, and we count down to 0. We don't launch the vehicle. Everything worked as advertised. Everything was all set to go. After the test, the ground crews went in to secure the spacecraft and the booster. When they went to remove the oxygen in the oxygen tanks, as they had done in previous tests, and they put gas into the fill line to force the liquid out the vent line, in this one particular tank, the one tank only, the gas going in was the gas going out, the liquid stayed right where it was. They didn't know what was wrong. It never happened before. So they went back to the schematics of the oxygen tanks and the history of this particular tank. And they discovered that the tank was dropped at the factory. Then they also looked at the schematics and discovered that should the tank be dropped in the factory, that there was a tube that could have been loosened that was giving them the symptoms that was occurring at the time. Then, now here's where Chris Kraft's statement might have some validity to it. They started to philosophize, all the engineers. They talked to the people that built the tank. They talked to the major contractor, North American. They talked to just about everybody, and themselves. And they said, if we remove the tank, we'll have to slip the flight about a month. But the tank worked perfectly for everything it had to do for a flight to the moon. It was only in the test that we could not take the oxygen out of the tank. So why don't we just turn on the heater system and boil the oxygen out? And everybody said that's not a bad idea. And so they turned on the heater system. Now they had two ways to determine the temperature inside the tank. They had a regular temperature gauge on the gantry by the spacecraft that could register the temperature inside the tank. They also had a readout, a continuous paper trail showing whether the power was on or off the heater system. It didn't show you what the temperature was, but it said, hey, the power goes on, the power goes off. As the heater was on, and the oxygen, of course, is a very low temperature, 250 degrees or 200 degrees, But as the oxygen started to boil off, as advertised, coming down, 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 when it got down to a lower strata, the temperature at the top of the tank started to rise because the heater was all throughout that whole system. The little thermostat now, which was designated to rise, to open up the contacts to shut off the power at 80 degrees, as the temperature kept going up, it finally got to 80 degrees, and the little thermostat started to open up, but the higher power at the Cape welded them shut. And from then on, there wasn't any safety factor. Now, the temperature gauge outside of the gantry was calibrated from about 250 degrees below zero to 80 degrees. That's it. So the temperature got up to about 80 degrees, but never went any farther. Stayed right there. The readout, the paper trail readout, was never looked at. And consequently, when they went back after the accident to look at the paper trail, the power stayed on. It never showed it dropping off, coming back on again, dropping off, coming back on again. And consequently, we know now from laboratory tests after the accident and the investigation that the tank temperature got up to about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Boiled off all the oxygen, ruined all the Teflon coating of the heater system, but no explosion. Nothing. Empty tank. Day or so before the launch, filled it up with oxygen again. It was a bomb ready to go off. Good question. What was the most important point in the flight of Apollo 13? Actually, the most important point in the flight of Apollo 13 was the time that the explosion occurred. If the explosion had occurred at the first time we turned on the heater system, we turned it on 2 times before the explosion occurred. In an early part of the flight, after we had committed ourselves to go to the moon, we would never have had enough electrical power left in the lunar module and the whole system to go all the way around the moon to come back home again. And we had already committed ourselves to go there, and the main propulsion system, of course, was dead. If the explosion occurred any time after we had gone into lunar orbit, or after we had started our landing with the lunar module, or after we had started to come up and rendezvous with the command module, if the explosion occurred any time during that period of all, we had never had enough fuel left in the lunar module to get back home safely. So if you want to say what was the most important point of this flight, other than the emotional point of the flight, it was the time the explosion occurred. So if you're going to go to the moon, and you're going to have an explosion, have it around 200,000 miles out, and then you have a chance of getting home. No, I set aside and did not really. We debriefed, of course, and Shepard's crew was there to listen to our debrief. But since we did not really land at Fra Mauro, we had no more knowledge of Fra Mauro than he had at the time. So I recycled to work with the scientists on the last missions when the crews were working on the lunar surface. I did not opt to ask for another flight to the moon after my 4th flight, my 2nd time to the moon. It's interesting to note, though, that on the first 2 flights to the moon, to ensure that the safety was of utmost factor, the management, the administrator of NASA, has said to both the Apollo 11 and Apollo 12 crews, now, look, don't take any unnecessary chances. If there's anything at all that's going wrong, we'll bring you home and we'll give you the very next flight to try it again. That's what he said on Apollo 11. That's what he told the Apollo 12 crew. Never told us at all. Consequently, maybe he thought that everything was so nice he didn't have to tell us. So at the time of the first press conference after we got home safely, and the very first question was asked by a reporter, are you going to ask for another flight to the moon? And I thought this was a perfect opportunity, because all of NASA management was also at the press conference, to put them in a box and in front of everybody, including the press, and force them into giving me another flight. And as I was debating in the brief seconds as to whether to say yes or no, I happened to look at my wife out of the audience, and she was going this. And I decided, well, some 21 people had not yet made a flight, period, it's not appropriate for me to try to make a fifth flight. And so I decided not to go for another flight. I think I was very fortunate to have the people I had on board in Apollo 13. I was disappointed that I couldn't have Ken Manley because he had trained for months and he was a good part of the crew, and I was a little worried that the synergy between the three of us, because Ken would be by himself when Fred and I were going to rendezvous with him, would be lost when we had Fred aboard or when we had Jack Swigert aboard. But we trained with Jack for a couple of days on that one particular aspect only, that the rendezvous of the two vehicles once we came back off the moon. But we were very fortunate to have Swigert and to have Fred Hayes. Fred Hayes was the expert of the lunar module. He had spent hours and hours at Grumman working with the design and the development, the testing of the lunar module. As I mentioned, Jack Swigert was intimately acquainted with the command module. He had done the malfunction procedures on it. So to have an accident, you couldn't ask for two better people to be there with you than Swigert and Hayes. Well, we always had redundancy in spacecraft, like we had for years in computers now. That was part of the philosophy of spacecraft design. High reliability, but redundancy. Of course, the one flight that went against that whole thing was the fact that redundancy wasn't a factor or wasn't a help in Apollo 13, because we lost all three fuel cells, all two fuel cells, all three fuel cells, all two oxygen tanks. Computer went off the line. We only had one computer. So the idea of putting a third oxygen tank on the command module, I guess, was a good one. And of course, they redid the heater systems, and they did all sorts of things in rebuilding the spacecraft for Apollo 14, which was probably, in some respects, pretty good that they could do that. I don't think NASA has become risk averse because spaceflight is a business. Anytime you take people and go at high rates of speeds, usually sitting on thousands of pounds of high explosives, take them out to a foreign body, or at least up into Earth orbit in a vacuum, and have to come back through an atmosphere generating very, very high temperatures at the blunt end of your vehicle. This is inherently a risky situation. And the key is how well we can engineer and build devices to do this. I have all the faith in the world in the technology of this country to build adequate spacecraft to do anything we want to do. And so I think that NASA is doing more, reaching out more and more and to do things in a very appropriate manner. I mean, they're not inherently risky. They're very careful in what they do, but this is a risky business. I disagreed with the cancellation of flights 18 and 19, and I think that was done partly because of the problem of 13. I think that in that particular aspect they were much too conservative, that we should have kept on going through at least Apollo 19. Now, Apollo 20 was sacrificed for Skylab, and that was probably a pretty wise decision. But we should have kept on going. Another tragedy of the space program, which in hindsight was really bad, was to cancel the construction and the use of the Saturn V booster. We had spent all this money on research and development, tooling, building beautiful, engines, the F1 engine and the J2 engines. The Saturn V can put more mass into low Earth orbit than our present-day shuttle. The beautiful vehicle which we could have used to build the International Space Station. We abandoned it. People are no longer there. The tooling's gone. I don't even know if the plans are around. And it cost us billions of dollars to probably rebuild a Saturn V. And we put all our eggs into the shuttle. It's flown over 100 times, and it's nice, but it's just a transportation device to eventually go up to the International Space Station. I think that technology to go to the Mars is already in hand. I don't think there's anything that we have to redesign or develop or invent or discover that would prevent us from building a satisfactory spaceship to go to Mars. The only question is the radiation factor, and whether a long voyage out into space with the radiation factor would be very significant to life. When we're going to go, I don't know. Are we going to go? Yes, we'll go, because Mars happens to be there. The technology is in hand. We will go. We'll probably go there in conjunction with eventually going back to the moon, using it as a training device or a base, or in the development of a Mars vehicle itself. And why we're going to go there? If you pin me to the wall and say, why are we going to spend all this money to send humans to Mars? I can't answer that question, because I don't know what we're going to find there. I don't know what benefit it's going to be for you or I or our grandchildren. But I have to tell you right now, man is a curious animal, and if he can do something, he's eventually going to do it. I think if we had decided to go to the moon today, and having the experience of the previous Apollo program, and our experience so far with Earth orbital flights, I think that we could actually probably make a moon voyage a lot easier. Certainly we'd have a lot better tracking capability. We know what to expect to land on the moon. We've tracked the moon itself quite a bit. We know the areas that we want to go to. We'd probably try some riskier ideas, like landing on the far side of the moon, to learn what Tsiolkovsky looks like, that beautiful crater on the far side. Maybe even visit the Lovell crater, which is over there. You never can see it anyway. Yeah, I think it would be easier to go to the moon today. Well, if I am remembered 100 years from now, I think I'd like to be remembered as part of the crew of the initial group of astronauts who pioneered our space activities, to help develop techniques to go into space, techniques to go to the moon, and sort of led the trail for the future exploration of space.